This is a victory from the steadfastness and the endurance of multiple war crimes, of horrific atrocities that our people of Gaza have faced day after day. And the news of this ceasefire brings with it the start of the fall of Zionism.
Welcome back to Popular Cradle. I'm Yara. After 15 months of genocide, Palestinian resistance has brought ceasefire to Gaza. Bombardment of Gaza has stopped. The Zionist military is set to withdraw from most of the Strip, and thousands of Palestinian prisoners will be freed from the occupation's prisons. So on this episode, Mohammed, Rhiannon, and I will discuss what we know so far about the ceasefire agreement, how we are thinking about this moment, and what it means for the Palestinian liberation movement outside of 48. We recorded this conversation on January 22nd, and so some details may have changed. As always, glory to our martyrs, glory to the steadfast people of Gaza, glory to the Palestinian nation. Okay, so we're recording this just a few days after January 19th, when phase one of the ceasefire started. So what do we know right now about what the terms are of the ceasefire? Like, what was agreed to in this ceasefire agreement? Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, we should probably start with the fact that this ceasefire has been the same kind of framework or same deal that's been on the table since May of 2024. I actually saw a video, I don't know how accurate it is, of one of the Qatari negotiators saying that the framework has been like this particular framework has been around since December of 2023.
That's right, actually.
Yeah, but basically, like, what we're looking at here is phase one has been agreed to. We know that they've split it up into 3 phases, but really it's only phase one that there's been agreement on and clarity on. And really what it involves is, well, one is going to be the withdrawal of the Israeli occupation forces from, I believe, all of Gaza, including key areas that were kind of like up in the air, right? Like the Netzarim corridor. So they're going to withdraw from Gaza or have already began their withdrawal. I don't know if Mohammed, you know more about like the debate around the Philadelphia corridor, whether they're withdrawing or whether they're reducing presence. It seems like it's like a slow, they're saying that they're going to reduce their presence in order to withdraw within the first 50 days. But phase one is only active for 42 days. And then they agreed on a exchange between Palestinian prisoners that are being held by the Israeli occupation, which is 3,000 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for 33 hostages. And then in addition to that, the complete return of Gazan refugees to the north. So the north, we've already started seeing this over the course of the last few days as people are returning to their homes in the north, and then the reopening of the Rafah border crossing. So, allowing for aid to go in. I think I even read something about wounded and sick Palestinians being able to leave through the Rafah crossing to seek treatment in Egypt. And I think those are just like, at a really high level, some of like the key elements of this ceasefire.
Yeah, so I think, Yara, for the most part, that's correct. I think the only sort of difference is they haven't agreed to withdraw from all of Gaza. If we take all of Gaza to mean every inch of Gaza, they have agreed to withdraw from the densely populated areas and
Yeah.
to basically go into establishing a new perimeter around the Gaza Strip temporarily based on agreed upon maps. And so I think one of the key lessons learned from the Lebanon ceasefire negotiations that took place a few months ago was that the Palestinian resistance saw that the Israelis and the Lebanese didn't agree upon any maps. It was like sort of defined terms, but with the Israelis, to hold them accountable, you have to actually place key areas under, I guess, a highlighter to note that you can't be here. No presence can exist in terms of Israeli occupation forces. The other thing is that with the Philadelphia corridor, it's a gradual withdrawal that won't be completed until stage 2. And they would still control the Rafah crossing, even though they will hand it over to civilian control. I think they've just decided upon that. They've decided that they would hand it to essentially non-affiliated Palestinians to run it, along with some international forces. Now, this is the agreement, right? There's already been breaches of this agreement, specifically related to the Philadelphia corridor. Netanyahu announced shortly after the actual ceasefire agreement went into place that they're not actually withdrawing gradually anybody from the Philadelphia corridor. They're actually increasing the presence of occupation soldiers. I don't know if that was rhetoric or if that's a reality. And I think beyond the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza and the return of Palestinians to the north, it's the prisoner exchange, obviously, is the most important aspect of this deal. And there's a formula that's in place that's categorized across quote unquote civilians versus women prisoners versus children prisoners, things like that, that we can get into. But the idea is in the first phase, a total of 3,000 Palestinian prisoners across different degrees of statuses, from administrative detainees to potential life sentences, will be released in exchange for a total of 33 hostages. And that will take place gradually over the course of 42 days.
Yeah. We've seen images already. 90 Palestinian prisoners, I believe, women and children, have been released already. And as Muhammad said, over the course of this phase one of the, most important, most central terms of this agreement is that about 3,000 Palestinian prisoners will be released. Yeah, we should turn to these prisoners, who they are, their significance, the significance of this being a central part of this agreement. Included on this list, including women and children, Palestinian prisoners, also famous and significant Palestinian political figures. We've talked on a previous episode about Marwan Barghouti, who is a prisoner who is on the list, named as going to be released in this phase one. Ahmed Saadat, Khalida Jarrar was already released. We've talked about all of these people before, so yeah, we should talk about who they are and the significance of all this.
Yeah, I mean, it ranges honestly from people who have been held in administrative detention. People like Hadil Shatara, who was picked up in the middle of this war, had her administrative detention renewed, and was released to see her family. And the only thing that she could say on the way out was, her mind was with Gaza and with the prisoners that they left behind.
Yeah.
I think at the time that the women were released, all the women were supposed to be released. There were, I want to say, 10 that remained behind. 3 of them were from Gaza. And then you also are seeing the release of people with life sentences, people who would have never seen freedom had this exchange not taken place, essentially. And we talked in previous episodes, in the prisoners episode, specifically about Palestinians have no other recourse, no other avenue, no court to petition, no international tribunal to attend to secure the release of their prisoners of war, essentially.
Yeah.
And so this is the only route that they have, and they've been able to secure that. Political figures, parliamentarians, people like Khaled Jarrar, like you said, who was essentially a political figure,
Right.
had no involvement in any sort of military struggle, but was arrested. The only charge she's ever been convicted of is membership in a proscribed organization, which she served a sentence for. Beyond that, she's sat in administrative detention for the vast majority of the time she's actually spent in prison, including in solitary confinement over the last 6 months.
For months.
And a
Yes.
solitary confinement that I can imagine was levied against her because she was teaching other Palestinian prisoners to be steadfast in their attachment to their identity and their struggle to withstand the brutality of prison, of the torturous conditions that they've experienced, especially since the start of this war. And so these are the types of people we're talking about. And as far as the political figures like Marwan Barghouti, who, he's on the list, as you said, Reep, but it's really a question of whether the Israelis hold to this. I think the second phase is where we're going to see the actual further release of prisoners, or when we start to get into the sort of main figures that you're referencing.
Right.
They've already agreed to a specific number of life sentences. I want to say it's 250 something. I don't remember the exact number, but there are 450 total, something around that. And so they are trying to hold to the notion that they have veto power over any prisoner that comes out, but they've already agreed to release at least what we know around 250. And those prisoners are potentially subject to deportation. That's something that is still in question, whether they'd be sent to Qatar or Turkey or Jordan. It's really complicated, or even maybe Egypt. A lot of these prisoners, the Israelis do not want to see them in the Gaza Strip, do not want to see them in West Bank, do not want to see them play unifying roles, right?
Right.
These specific prisoners. And there's also the question of 48 prisoners, which the Israelis, up until this point, refuse to negotiate about.
These are prisoners that are Palestinians who are citizens of the Zionist state, right? They're from cities within what we call 48, which is like, historic Palestine. One of the examples of a famous 48 prisoner would be Walid Dakka, right? Who was martyred in prison last year, who died with cancer because of medical negligence. And, we know that there was a lot of energy around the possibility of releasing Walid. Yeah.
And the reason they won't negotiate over these people is because they don't recognize them as Palestinians, right? They don't want to recognize their imprisonment as part of the targeting of this national liberation project, whose membership extends from the river to the sea, whose membership is inclusive of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And so there's also the question of Yahya Sinwar's body. They refuse to release his body. So the prisoner exchange actually reveals both the sort of resilience of the Palestinian people, the depth and breadth of the types of people who engage with this struggle: educators, activists, parliamentarians, these different types of people, fighters, obviously, and also the breadth and depth of Israeli depravity, of their desire to subjugate Palestinians, their willingness to deprive Palestinians of joy. That joy becomes a criminal offense. And in fact, we've seen dozens of Palestinians arrested over the last few days because they expressed enthusiasm or joy over the release of prisoners. We've also seen a mass roundup of Palestinians from the West Bank to be further imprisoned.
New arrests. Exactly.
New prisoners, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, while this prison exchange, I think, brings a lot of joy for Palestinians, it also reminds us that this is an ongoing struggle. Like it doesn't end or begin with the release of these prisoners, as we see with what's transpired since.
Yeah, and I think there's something that you said, Muhammad, that's super important around like who these prisoners are. You mentioned like the unifying role that they play. I know we've talked about it on the episode that we did on prisoners, but one of the things that makes prisoner exchanges so important is they re-energize the future of the struggle. Like there's obviously on the one hand, there's like this moral thing, right? Which is like, our people are sitting in prisons and that we need to play a role in supporting them and working towards their release, right? Like I think that there's that. But then on the actual like level of the struggle itself, we've seen historically that the figures that get released in prisoner exchanges then go on to play a role in the next phase of the struggle. So like, for example, the prisoner exchange that took place in 1985, that was the Jibril agreement that I know we've talked about before, where, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who would play a critical or central role in founding Hamas, was released. There was also the release of Ziad al-Khalid during that same exchange, who then went on to become one of the leaders of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The 2011 prisoner exchange, which saw the release of Yahya Sinwar, right? And so you have these like people who are released in the moment who then go on to lay a foundation for or play a critical role in the future of the struggle. And so in a moment like this, where we're talking about, large scale destruction in Gaza, we're talking about a unspeakable and unimaginable genocide, the ability to release prisoners plays a critical role in shaping the future of the Palestinian struggle.
Yeah, and reconstituting our people, reconstituting the Palestinian body politic, right? And putting together a Palestinian political future by releasing these people who will assuredly play central roles in what's to come for our people. So you have this victory on the one hand of the release of Palestinian political prisoners. And then on the other hand, part of this victory really exposes internal crises happening right now in Israeli society and Israeli politics. Just to go back to like the terms of the ceasefire, we mentioned already that, this framework, the basic terms here that were agreed to have been on the table are the same terms that were being negotiated and that Hamas agreed to in May of 2024. Broadly, the same terms that have been on the table since December of 2023. But really importantly, throughout that time, those terms weren't ever agreed to up until this point, supposedly because Israel was insisting, for their part, on other terms. Right? The general's plan, massive security coordination, security, oversight in perpetuity in Gaza, etc. Now, those terms are not in this ceasefire agreement. So let's talk about like what were they insisting on and why is it significant that they actually didn't get those terms into this agreement?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know like what terms they were insisting on other than to say that like the way that the Israelis were speaking about this war was as if this was like an existential war, right? Like that they one of their goals was, for example, to destroy Hamas, basically make it so that Hamas would have no presence left in Gaza. They were also talking about freeing the hostages, right? And this idea that they could do that through military force. And I think part of this is also like Israel was trying to the way I see it, was trying to buy time, like, was trying to basically, this deal has been on the table. They didn't wanna take this deal. They actually wanted to enact colonialism, right? We know through the general's plan that you mentioned, like, they wanted to actually take the North. They wanted to occupy the North. They wanted to settle settlers into the North. And there was a serious barrier to all of these plans, which was the fact that Palestinians were remaining steadfast on their land, that Palestinian resistance remained active and sophisticated, in unimaginable conditions. There was the reality of, other actors, regional actors entering the war to support Gaza. And all of this made it really difficult for Israel to be able to accomplish these kinds of like, I mean, like Israel had these broad goals that it wasn't able to accomplish, right? The destruction of Hamas, the return of the hostages, but then they also had like these particular goals around the north through the general's plan, the Netzarim corridor, wanting to settle essentially in Gaza,
Yeah, very
and
explicit, just colonial expansion, just expanding
exactly.
the settler colony. Yeah,
Exactly, yeah, like, I think we were seeing, like, them talking openly about selling condos in the north of Gaza, right? And
right.
then
Yeah,
they weren't able to actually accomplish these goals, and I think that stall between, like, May or that delay between whether you wanna take it up as a delay between May till now or from December 2023 till now was really Israel was trying to accomplish military goals and political goals that it had set out to accomplish, that it wasn't able to, and they were trying to buy as much time as possible to create military realities or particular realities on the ground that the Palestinian resistance didn't allow for them to create.
Yara, beyond, I mean, what you've said so far, I think that's absolutely right. Beyond that, I think there was also a navigation of internal crises that took place throughout the duration of this war, right? And
Right.
so you have Netanyahu who's holding together a coalition government and a war cabinet where you have on one side a far right fascistic, not to say that he's not fascistic or his coalition more broadly is not fascistic, but the most fascistic elements of Israeli society, pushing for what you were describing, the settlement of the North, the total military occupation of the Gaza Strip, akin to what we're seeing in the West Bank, the complete disarmament of Gaza and the Palestinian resistance, essentially subjugation of Palestinians. And this far right force within his coalition conditioned their presence within his government, which is teetering on the verge of collapse. Their presence was conditioned on these goals being implemented. Now, the IDF, the Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, the Shin Bet, the various forces that are actually tasked with executing the war have long said this is unachievable.
yeah.
They've
Right.
long leaked in the media, like Yoav Gallant, the previous defense minister who was fired more recently, said this was an impossible feat and it's not something that we were going to achieve. And so you have on the one side the actual executors of this genocide, the other side these politicians that are threatening Netanyahu, and this created a crisis for him. And then you have the US government that's obviously unconditionally supporting this war in the Biden administration, reluctant to place any sort of pressure or even condition military aid or financial aid or political cover on an actual change in the prosecution of this war. The only thing that they sort of placed ceilings on was on the number of Palestinians allowed to be starved to death. Beyond that, I think you're right. It was a waiting game, but it was also the navigation of this crisis. In addition to all of that, they were thinking that Trump would bring them more favorable terms, that they
Right.
would allow them. And they said this much. One of Netanyahu's confidants, one of his close advisors, went on, I want to say Channel 12, Israeli news, and said basically, we thought Trump would allow us to starve Palestinians to death, like unendingly. And
Yeah.
he told us effectively no. And
Mhm.
so, these they thought that the only way to sort of completely displace Palestinians from the north was to essentially cut them off from food, water, fuel, things that would allow them to survive. And when that wasn't allowed to happen, we have this ceasefire deal. But I think there's a lot to be said about how the coalition has now responded. Ben
Right.
Gvir has since resigned. Smotrich is threatening to resign should the war not continue, resign from the coalition, that is, as a member from the coalition government. And this has really jeopardized Netanyahu's standing. And it's more complicated than just being able to sustain a government, to prosecute a war in order to stay in power, because Netanyahu can stay in power after this moment. It's about on what terms he stays in power and on what interests he's able to guarantee for himself narrowly in this new government that would allow him to survive should Ben Gvir and Smotrich walk away from him.
Yeah, and I think Muhammad, just to dig into something you said real quick on this question of the government and the coalition is like from the beginning there has been a lot of analysts have pointed to this, which is like Netanyahu is in like a really precarious position, which is like on the one hand he has like these what is considered the far right, right, which is Smotrich, Ben Gvir, so on, who he's really reliant on in terms of his government. But then on the other hand, there was agitation from within his own party, from within segments of the sort of Zionist political class, whether you have Gantz and then who's the other one? Lapid,
Lapid, yeah.
right? Like these figures that are actually um, favored by the United States in some ways, right? Or at least
At
historically
least by the
have been.
Democrats. Yeah, at least by the
Exactly.
Democrats, yeah.
Yeah, and so, like, you have kind of he's dealing with this situation where on the one hand, you have the I don't wanna call it the centrist wing, but I guess I will, of the coalition that's basically saying, we need a deal to bring the hostages home, right? And then you have crisis inside the country, which are protests against Netanyahu because the war hasn't brought the hostages home. And then on the other side, you've got the right wing that's, I mean, we saw how the right wing kind of what role the right wing played around Lebanon front, right? Which was like, that the settlers of the north have been displaced and so Netanyahu must go to war with Lebanon in order to allow the settlers to return home. And I think like this point that you bring up about the response of the right wing, I think it was Ben Gvir that outright called this deal a disgrace and a defeat. Like the
Right.
language that was used was so dramatic. And, we're basically like in this position where the right wing is even now, like Smotrich is continuing to agitate on the question of returning to the war after the 42 days.
Right.
So it's so many factors that contribute to, the ceasefire agreement, the ink going down on it. Signatures, right? It's agreed to. It begins its implementation on just this past Sunday. And so we've talked about one of the big factors that went into it is these very deep internal crises in Israel, in Israeli politics and Israeli society. There's also this really big factor that I think really gets missed in sort of mainstream discourses. Even media that's like, let's say, supportive of the Palestinian cause right now, there's a huge focus on like, oh, well, Trump got this done.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And so We should talk about Trump and Trump's role in this and his people's role in this because it is one factor. But missed in all of this discourse is the resistance's role
Right.
in getting this done, in getting the deal that it said it would agree to back in May of 2024, right? And how the resistance was actually the most central factor in this ceasefire being agreed to, right?
Absolutely. And I think, like, especially over the last few weeks, the focus of the Israeli campaign against Palestinians in Gaza has been on the north, right? Has been on Jabalia camp, has been on essentially ethnically cleansing the north. And the greatest rate of casualty in recent past, in terms of since the later stages of the war, was in the last few weeks for Israeli soldiers. And essentially, you've done all of this destruction. The target bank is dried up. You've already systematically destroyed every avenue for social reproduction: hospitals, schools, mosques, what have you. There's very little left to destroy by way of Gaza as a place where people can live,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so that's done, and all you have now is you occupied this destroyed area. You set up command posts and destroyed buildings, only for a group of 3 to 5 people to come out of a tunnel, essentially carry out an operation against a handful of your soldiers and go back in that tunnel day in and day out. That's what they've been facing.
Every single day.
And
Right. Every single day. It doesn't stop.
it's not stopping. And for what, you've essentially besieged these people. Like, conceptually, you've cut them off from their ability to replenish their weapons, for them to seek medical care, for them to survive on, rations. You've essentially, like, isolated this group of people. But on the other hand, they're still going without an end in sight. And I think the main sort of variable in all of this, to be real about it, are the tunnels. The tunnels are probably where they have the capacity to reproduce weaponry, where they have the capacity to seek shelter, essentially protect themselves from air bombardments and drones and everything else that Israelis have superiority in. And they come out when they need to and go in when they don't. And so that's basically what's allowed them to prevent the Israeli occupation from holding any territory for an extended period of time. So if you can't do this, you're not going to be able to build settlements.
Right.
If you can't do this, you can't then turn around to your domestic population and say, we've completely degraded and destroyed Hamas. What we've promised to do, what we've said is the goal of this war.
Yeah.
And at the end of it, a ceasefire agreement takes place. And then what do we see the next day once it's actually implemented?
Like a parade, people embracing, Hamas fighters and soldiers out in the streets. Like, I mean, even when during the prisoner exchange, like the images, they tried to ban displays of joy and, stalled to release the Palestinian prisoners until the middle of the night. And then you see this video of prisoners on this truck, and people are up on top of the truck celebrating. And there's, for example, like Hamas flags, like, this idea that you've succeeded, or this notion that they had of succeeding, whether it be in Gaza or elsewhere, clearly failed.
Yeah. And it's like you wanted an image of victory, and instead you received an image of defeat on day one after the ceasefire was implemented. And it's really shocking to Israeli society, because these videos that we all watched, they watched too.
Mhm.
And this is what actually drove them mad, I think, beyond, like the facts that they don't like the terms of the actual agreement, is they saw the images and they said, okay, well, it's not enough that we've genocided these people. It's not enough that we've
Mhm.
destroyed their entire society, but they have to feel defeat as well.
Mhm.
They must hold their heads low. They must be begging on their knees. And that's not what they got. And,
Right.
for me, I think one of the reasons this ceasefire may fail is because of the images that they saw. And the reality is they'll never see a different image.
Yeah.
That will be the image if the ceasefire stays or it doesn't,
Right.
whether it's implemented in 6 months or a year or 3 or 5.
Right.
Right. Right. Because the victory for the Palestinian people is that they did remain steadfast and that they will remain steadfast. Like that period, that's it, right? Like that's the end of the sentence. That is the future. That is the present. And so Israel did not win. There is no victory in their genocide of the Palestinian people because the North was not depopulated,
Right.
right? The Palestinian people stayed in the north, stayed on the rubble of their homes and said, we will not leave, even when it was fully besieged, right?
Mhm.
Hamas fighters obviously still fully operational in the north of Gaza until the ceasefire was reached every single day, like you said, Muhammad. And so, in terms of like who can count it or take credit for a victory and who is defeated and that kind of thing, it was incredibly clear within hours of the morning of Sunday the 19th, right? Who was rejoicing and claiming and stepping into that victory, right? For a people. And that was the Palestinians. And that was people in Gaza. And that was people in the West Bank welcoming prisoners who had just been released.
Yeah, and it's not just that like resistance remained or that Palestinians remained steadfast or that Israel wasn't able to defeat Hamas. It's also that Hamas recruited through the course of this genocide. I think it was Blinken in one of his last press conferences, maybe it was even the last one, but he basically said that Hamas recruited more fighters than they had lost.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, we obviously saw images and footage of celebration by Palestinians, but then we've talked about just in the past few days that a lot of uncertainties have come up as well. We've said phase one is the only thing that has been agreed to. It's not even, everybody's waiting to see if that's even implemented, if Israelis hold up their end of the deal through even phase one, the agreed upon terms. Phase two and phase three, still very much up in the air. So, what remains to be seen right now?
I think the most unpredictable variable is Trump, is the Trump administration and how Trump will actually implement the policies or his strategy for the region. So, in his previous term, Trump was arguably the most pro Israel president in American history.
Yeah.
And he obviously moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He recognized sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He did anything and everything the Israelis wanted him to do. But in this instance, what's coming from Israeli media is that Trump actually forced this deal. But on Inauguration Day, actually, in his most recent interview, I guess, Trump basically said he's not confident that this ceasefire will last and that it's not the US's war, it's their war. And so this is the unpredictability we have. Netanyahu's collapsing coalition and the internal contradictions that we talked about driving his sort of decision making, does that win out against Trump's seeming desire to bring this war to an end, to essentially avoid responsibility for having to manage a crisis himself? From his envoy, Steve Witkoff, his comments more recently in his interview with Fox, I think just in the last day, was asked, what his thoughts were on Trump's comments. He said, we are committed to seeing through every phase of this ceasefire, right? And when asked about Hamas comments saying that they were interested in working with the administration to implement this ceasefire throughout its phases, he said, if it's true that they're committed or that they've said this, then he welcomes it, so to speak. Not in those exact words, but this is what he said. And obviously the
Yeah.
reaction from some of the other neocons around,
Like Nikki Haley.
right, Nikki Haley and
Yeah,
others.
she already said the United States should never, she put it on Twitter right away. The United States should never negotiate with Hamas.
Right. And so I think Trump is a person that is driven by something unlike any other president, his own narrow interests, his desire to be seen in a very specific way, to live up to some sort of image or reputation. He wants to be the person who's brought peace. He talks about deserving the Nobel Peace Prize. And he openly attacks Netanyahu from time to time, from sharing that video of Mersheimer calling Netanyahu a bitch and saying that Israel is trying to drag the US into war with Iran, to snuffing Netanyahu from time to time because he congratulated Biden on his election victory in 2020. So this is someone it's really hard to say. At the same time, when he discusses Gaza, he talks about Gaza as a potential real estate investment,
That's right.
about how it's a beautiful location on the
In the same press
Mediterranean
conference
Sea.
where he said, yeah, in the same press conference where he said he's not confident all of the sudden that, the terms of the ceasefire will be implemented or seen all the way through. He turns, sort of like in this unprincipled, just so specifically Trump way into talking about like we could build some beautiful homes there. Like that's
Yeah, I mean, unlike Biden, who is like an ideological Zionist, right? Like he's
right.
committed to Zionism as a project that he understands to be this ideological project, right?
Mhm.
Trump views this purely in transactional terms, right? Like, who can I arrange a deal with on what terms? I just want it done. Some people win in a deal, some people lose. At the end of the day, we keep it pushing, right? Like that's
Right.
how he thinks about these things.
Right.
So much so that Steve Witkoff, the envoy that he sent, is like a real estate tycoon from Vegas. Like it's not like he's like this Middle Eastern studies
Right.
PhD who works at some sort of, think tank.
This
He's
isn't a
just a
career
guy who makes
diplomat.
deals
Yeah.
for land. And that's it. And so, I mean, I hate to describe Trump and empire this way because, often when we do engage in analysis, we're talking about strategy and geopolitics and the different visions that people have for advancing capitalist interest and all of this stuff. And there's definitely aspects to that in Trump because at the end of the day, Trump is a member of the US ruling class. He
Yeah.
is tied to specific interests, whether it's real estate and construction, whether it's oil and fossil fuels more broadly, that's him. But also, he's the guy who says himself that he's not big on war.
Right. Right.
And maybe it's because for him, these things create too much uncertainty for investments that he believes should be priority for the US in the Middle East. It's really hard to say.
Mhm.
But what we know is the people he surrounded himself with represent both the neocon wing of the right wing of this country, people like Marco Rubio. At the same time, he just appointed, for example, Michael Domino as chief Middle East policy advisor at the Pentagon, somebody who's also echoed this politics around Iran and Israel pushing the US into war with Iran, and who's been said to be influential in Trump's thinking around this question, right?
Yeah, and I also think on this question of like how Trump thinks, the uncertainty that lies ahead, one of the things that a lot of us also have on top of mind is the question of normalization and the West Bank, right? Because like, did Trump engage in backdoor deals? Like these are like, I mean, we're speculating at this point, right? Like we're a
Mhm.
week out, at time of recording. And so like we're obviously speculating, but like were there backdoor deals of like, end the war in Gaza and I'll do this when it comes to the West Bank, right? Like we know that things are developing in the West Bank. One of Trump's first orders was to lift the sanctions against the settlers.
Yes.
And so like, that's I don't know, that's weird. That's suspicious, right? And so I think that move by Trump signals something for sure. Then there's the question of like normalization and Saudi Arabia, right? Like this is the president that advanced the Abraham Accords. His whole vision was around deals and normalization, which would allow for American capitalist expansion and relationships, right, in the Middle East. And so I think that these are all major uncertainties. And then there's to add to that the question of like the uncertainty of will the ceasefire even hold, right? So we're like talking about this question of will the ceasefire hold, but then we're talking also about like if it does hold, what is to come when it comes to the broader region and what is to come when it comes to the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, and the role that actors like Saudi Arabia could potentially play in Gaza's future.
Yeah, for Trump's part, he's already said this week, right, that normalization with Israel is going to happen. He has said that. It's just a question of when. And Trump has said, but, what we need first in order to get to normalization is a ceasefire. We need to end the war, and then we can start working on normalization, right? Big open questions, I like it's the same worries, Yada. Like you wonder, like, okay, well, did Trump say, well, end the war in Gaza, but, yeah, you can go ahead and start annexing the West Bank, right? Settlement expansion seems to be obviously already greenlit with removing the executive order that removes sanctions on far right so called settlers in the West Bank. So, yeah, a lot of this remains to be seen. If we can't say Trump is staunchly ideologically Zionist, we can't say he's very staunchly reliably ideologically capitalist, right? It's always about transaction to him. So those are big open questions about what were the other transactions that we didn't see that were part of this deal.
You know what's interesting? Something that just happened. The Israeli Knesset just reviewed a bill, and it was voted down. It was brought by the opposition, so not Netanyahu's coalition, with the exception of Smotrich voting for it. A bill to move in the direction of annexing the Jordan Valley, which is in the West Bank, right? A major territory of the West Bank. And the Likud officials who voted it down, the members of parliament, and his party basically stated that the reason that they voted it down is because that is not how annexation will occur. And we need to have our partners in the Americans on board and on the same page regarding annexation.
Meaning it won't happen just because we pass a law,
Yeah.
but because our partners, the US, are actually helping us materially and concretely do it.
Mhm.
Yes. But the question is, well, why not just vote it in? Like, what do you lose? Now, I think there's some Israeli domestic considerations around the opposition trying to make Netanyahu look bad and the far right joining that in this moment, right? Like this, there's a gamesmanship in this, bringing this bill forward, but voting it down, by people who ostensibly support the annexation of the Jordan Valley doesn't make sense to me unless there were specific things said by the Trump administration around their expectations on what is
Right.
allowed to happen or not happen, on what pace and on what terms, involving who.
Right.
Like I'm just I'm just thinking out loud here, but like that was something interesting that I was like, wait a minute, why is this being voted down? It makes no
No, no.
sense.
No, it's a really good point, and it goes back to, our past episode. We called this a US-led genocide, right? That's because the US is behind all of this. This is the US controls by a large degree. It's not the other way around, right? Where the US is controlled by Israel. No, Israel's every single move against the Palestinians is the US is behind it or leading or facilitating, right? They're part and parcel in this project. So there's a lot of uncertainty. One thing just to maybe turn it back in terms of what's uncertain or what questions remain in terms of the conditions of Palestinians, particularly in Gaza right now. Something that's really uncertain for me is like, you see the devastation that has been wrought on Gaza, almost total devastation that, Gaza as a place, as a geographical location, as cities, like that's almost been completely decimated. And so, what does it mean then in the short and the long term to rebuild Gaza? And how does that happen? I think that's a really big question.
I mean, I think on the question of rebuilding, there's like this major uncertainty that there was a lot of speculations around this like a few months ago where the Israelis were saying that they were going to agree to a like a post-war, right? Like a day after kind of plan, which involved
Yeah.
essentially setting up local committees in Gaza that were being run by the Palestinian, and there were debates, right? Like, is it going to be the Palestinian Authority? Is it going to be, I mean, I watched this interview even with, what's her name? I'm forgetting her name, but she's the mayor of Haifa, I think. She's a terrible Zionist. But basically, she was talking about like the role of the Emirates and if Saudi Arabia normalizes the role of Saudi Arabia in helping administer and rebuild a Gaza that she talked about as like a Gaza where like the good Palestinians, quote unquote, right here, she's talking about like, and like not taking up project of resistance would be able to cultivate. And so I think there's like this question around like the day after still feels really uncertain. And it's hard to even think about that when you're dealing with the question of like, will this ceasefire last? Right. Like, and so there's this reality, which is that so much of Gaza, I think like over 85% of Gaza has been destroyed. And we're seeing these videos coming out of the north. Right. And it's shocking. And you even see like mainstream media that has been for the last 15 months giving cover to this genocide, acting shocked at these videos, right, as if they didn't know about it. But these videos are really terrifying and they signal this long road ahead in terms of
Yeah.
rebuilding. But then I think there's something else that needs to be named when it comes to rebuilding is that oftentimes imperialist powers will use rebuilding in a way to try to further destroy the project of resistance, right? And so I think it was in Jenin, for example, where I'm forgetting who played a role in the rebuilding, whether if it was Gulf nations or who it was. I don't know if Mohammed, you remember, but they rebuilt the camp in a way to try to make it more difficult for resistance to take place in the camp, right? And so I think like there's going to be this broader question around rebuilding of like how is Gaza going to be rebuilt? What actors are going to play a role in facilitating that process? What political objectives do those actors have in terms of like the national liberation struggle? And then I think that there's this broader question of like the diaspora's role and the Palestine movement's role, right? I think historically, or at least for the last little while, aid is oftentimes treated as like this really apolitical kind of thing. But I think there's this broader question of what role can the movement in North America and in Europe and so on play in continuing to support Palestinians and staying steadfast on the land and rebuilding, and then also potentially like this question of holding Israel accountable for what it's done.
Just thinking about what the last 15 months have wrought, what the Zionist entity in the US has wrought on the Palestinian people, that massive devastation, that massive cost. There is a not uncommon sentiment, even in our community, or, a question about like, is the cost of resistance too high? If the enemy can do this to our people, and if they can do genocide just for retribution, right? Like what's the point then? And so when it comes down to it, is it even worth it to continue to resist?
I think, the intent of this genocide is to break the Palestinians. But what does it mean to break them? Like break them on what? Like break them as like holding a national identity, break them in terms of cultural or their social relate. What does it mean to break them? And I think in a way that Israel operated historically has tried to destroy the Palestinian nations in so many different ways. Mass displacement was the main one. And then when that didn't work, confinement and occupation. And when that didn't work, now you got to just liquidate
Kill
them,
them.
kill
Yeah.
them wholesale. Like, it's going through its tools. And to survive that is to be victorious, to be standing is victorious in the face of that, because then the struggle continues, right? Like we have no other options as a people, because you can look at it from one of two ways. You can look at it from saying like, oh, this war was so devastating. Was this worth it? And this is a genuine question that people
Hmm.
are asking, and they get to ask,
Yes.
especially the people of Gaza.
Yes.
Is it worth it to fight this beast when it can do this to us? And a lot of Palestinians have answered the question saying, no, it's not worth it to fight this beast. And in fact, that is the answer of, if you want to be generous in your interpretation of the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah as it currently stands, they say, listen, we tried this, it doesn't work.
Right. They kill us.
And we're not going to do it anymore because the cost is way greater than any benefit we could ever generate out of this struggle. That is a generous interpretation. And there's people who genuinely can feel this way.
Mhm.
But the contrast is to say, well, you know, looking at this movement, this project, and the direction it's taken over years, like the right wing, the Zionists, do we really have an option?
Mhm.
They're willing to do this to destroy our sense of nationhood, our desire to self determine, our desire to want to relate to one another as members of the same group of people with political aspirations, not civil aspirations or religious aspirations or social aspirations,
Mhm.
you know? And so this is what they're willing to do, and they failed in that. This is the furthest they could have gone. This is the furthest. I mean, they could have killed a few more people. They could have starved a few more people. But what more can they do to a people to try to make them kneel than what they did? And we still come out like as a people saying it's not enough.
Yeah.
Like we're still
We won.
we're gonna fight this.
Yeah.
We're not walking away from our land in our struggle.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the reality is like this question of like was it worth it, or is the path of resistance the correct path? I mean, one only has to really look at the alternative, right? Which is what's taken place in the West Bank, right? With, I mean, Mohammed, you mentioned the Palestinian Authority with a Palestinian leadership that effectively helps to facilitate Israel's project. And there's still colonialism, there are settlements, there's mass imprisonment. When we think about what are the choices in front of the Palestinian people, I mean, if our fight is to free our land and to free our nation, then really there's only this one path. And I think one of the things that has been so clear about the last 15 months is that what the Zionist state has been trying to do is basically destroy in the Palestinian psyche the project of resistance. They sought to create a genocide so brutal that people would never, the people of Gaza and the people of all of Palestine, the people of Lebanon, like all of the people in the region would never ever think again to stand up against Israel or to stand up against Israeli expansion or to fight for their sovereignty and for their freedom by trying to extract a cost that is so high that the people of these countries, and especially the people of Palestine, basically feel that this cost is too high to pay for the struggle. But I think one of the things that I think about a lot in these kinds of discussions, especially as we start to veer into this kind of doubt, right? Like of was it worth it? And we saw this question be asked, is Bassel al-Araj, who is a Palestinian revolutionary intellectual that was martyred, he has this language that he used, which is al-muqawama jadwa al-mustamirra, which kind of translates to the ongoing benefit of resistance. And his case study was largely Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank, where we currently see both the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli occupation forces engage in a brutal assault of Jenin. But, Bassel looked at Jenin and he basically said, Jenin is an example of the ongoing benefit of resistance because the Zionist settlements haven't been able to expand into Jenin. And so, where in other parts of the West Bank, because the project of resistance was not continuous, because the Palestinian Authority was able to govern and rule and draw people away from resistance towards, state building and so on, settlements were able to expand, right? But Jenin, the settlements were never able to enter Jenin because the resistance of the people of Jenin was steadfast and was continuous. And so that resistance has this ongoing benefit that allows for contribution to the struggle against colonialism, that allows for the fight towards sovereignty. And, we talked about this in the case of like the North in Gaza, right? Like the fact that that resistance continued in the North is what made it impossible for settlement to take place, for the general's plan to take place, you know? And so I think when we put all of this together, right, obviously we're speaking about this also in the context of incredible human loss, but we're also speaking about this in the context of, a struggle that the Palestinian people have been waging for, over 75 years that does come with extreme sacrifice. But what allows for our people to make those sacrifices is through belief in the ability to be victorious.
So we've seen this genocide play out over the past 15 months. Finally, a ceasefire has been reached, even if it was the same ceasefire that was on the table back in May, back in 2 Decembers ago. And, over the course of the past 15 months, so many people across the world have taken up support and solidarity with the Palestinian cause. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions around the world in the streets to mobilize, to protest, students taking up the Palestinian cause, calling on their universities to divest from Israel and from genocide. And so, to what extent do we think that international pressure and this international solidarity movement with Palestine, how much did that play a role in this ceasefire being reached?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that we've been saying sort of for a while is like the most important kind of struggle is the struggle that's going to be waged on the ground, right? And I think, we should be honest about that and, about the like we've been talking throughout the course of this episode on, the samud of the steadfastness of our people, about their, the ongoing resistance that's been taking place and so on. But I don't think that means we need to be like defeatist about the role that we've played as a movement either. In the last 15 months, the way in which Palestine has become such a critical kind of issue and the level of consciousness around Palestine that's been raised, the amount of people that have been shifted or moved into struggle through the developments in Palestine, right? I mean, like, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who are going to champion this cause, right? And that's really, really critical. But then I think there's also the reality that when we talk about creating crisis for a Zionist entity or crisis for the political class in the imperialist nations, right? Like, I think that that's something that this movement has been able to do. Like, we're now in a place where Israel is seen by so much of the world as a perpetrator of genocide. Like, the Zionist entity has been exposed, and we know that Israel has historically really, really invested so much money into the question of propaganda, right? This is a country that, you talked about having the world's most moral army and, these kinds of things, and even tried to frame itself as like an indigenous nation, right? And we're in a place where it's isolated on a world level. There are countries that have cut trade with Israel. We've seen, ICC and ICJ rulings. We're seeing things like IOF soldiers being confronted, being, pursued legally across the world. I think there was even like this notice that was put out by Israel to kind of warn its soldiers to like delete the footage that they might have showing themselves as having participated in this war, because there's so much concern about what's to come. And that's in large part because of the movement that has been built, right? That has exposed Israel for what it is, shown that this is not, the quote unquote world's most moral army, created crisis for Israel. And certainly has also created a crisis for imperialist nations supporting Israel. I mean, we didn't really, it's hard to speculate around this when it comes to Donald Trump, but like, there's questions around how much does he also not want to deal with the mass movement that's been built on Palestine, right? This is a person who is interested in, Muhammad, you were saying this earlier around like concerned about the instability to capital that would come with war, right? That also applies to the question of like domestic protests and so on. And so I think that the movement that's been built over the course of the last 15 months has played a really important role, and was able to show that the people of Gaza are not alone, and galvanize millions of people all across the world in support of Gaza, in support of their steadfastness. And I think the task of this movement is not done yet, right? Like now the question is, how do we take the hundreds of thousands of people that have been, moved by this moment and have them commit to the long struggle ahead for the liberation of Palestine?
Yeah, because ceasefire is the floor. A cessation of that escalated genocide is just the first step. But we know, of course, that liberation is the goal, total liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. And so, maybe as just a final question to put to both of you, what's our role now as organizers, as supporters of the Palestinian cause in the US and the far diaspora? What's our role now?
Yeah, that's such a huge question to try to answer. But I think that on a very basic level, it's to intensify and deepen the work that we have been doing. It's to expand our ability to actually place pressure, to create crisis, to build solidarity with others, to develop a united front against not just Zionism or imperialism, but to understand them as systems integral to each other's successes and requiring that, requiring internationalism, solidarity between these different movements, different victims, different targets of these systems. And I know this is something we say so often, but there's no other magic formula that we can come up with other than to struggle. And, for us as a movement, as the Palestine movement, we've now had the experience of 15 months trying various strategies, tactics to try to confront this system, this beast. We know what works, what doesn't. We know what we need to build in order for those strategies and tactics to be more successful in the future. But with the Trump administration, with the uncertainty around the ceasefire, with the plans related to the West Bank, normalization of the region, our struggle must be flexible, must be responsive, must be focused, and must be attentive to these different developments and changes so that we're able to meet them and confront them head on. And so, that requires organization, that requires a incubator that's able to actually accumulate lessons, experiences, and skills to develop networks, relationships, and resources that are then able to build on this past moment, to build on the last 15 months, and to be better and stronger than we were in our actual fight to end this genocide.
This people, the Palestinian people, prefer to die standing than to lose its case. We achieved proving that this nation is going to continue fighting till victory. We achieved that our people could never be defeated. We achieved teaching every single person in this world that we are a small, brave nation who are going to fight to the last drop of blood to put justice for ourselves after the world failed in giving it to us. This is what we achieved. To us, to liberate our country, to have dignity, to have respect, to have our mere human rights is something as essential as life itself.
Popular Cradle is made in partnership with the Palestinian Youth Movement. Thank you to the many people who contributed to the making of this episode. Our editor is Soraya Shockley. Our artwork is by Shenbi G and Vivek Venkatraman. Our theme music is composed by Salma Talib and performed by Clarissa Bitar and Hisham Jarmakani. Follow, like, and subscribe to us on social media at Popular Cradle. That's YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram at Popular Cradle.